Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this year's annual David Goodbourn Lecture. My name is Peter Colwell. I'm the Deputy General Secretary of Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. The annual David Goodbourn Lecture is in memory of a former General Secretary of CTBI and former President of the Luther King Centre in Manchester. And this was set up some years ago in his memory. We focus on aspects of ecumenism, theology, and justice. And it is a partnership between Churches Together in Britain and Ireland and the Luther King Centre for Theological Education in Manchester. So I'm going to introduce to you now the Bishop of Gloucester, the Rt.Revd Rachel Treweek, who is going to chair this evening's lecture and introduce our speaker. Can I say that be ready to post your questions in the question box, and we will be putting questions after the lecture. And when the whole event is finished, a recording of this evening's lecture will be available within the next few days for you to revisit or to share with others in your churches and networks. So Rachel, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Yes, my name is Bishop Rachel, Bishop of Gloucester, and may I add my own words of thanks to say what a privilege it is to be chairing this lecture this evening as we turn our thoughts to the Holy Land, to Israel and Palestine. I've had the privilege of visiting the land a number of times, 3 times in the last 4 years, and most recently in January. We gather this evening, of course, against the background of the ongoing conflict with Iran, the ongoing situation of mess and conflict and pain across that region. And of course, closer to home, we're aware of the local division, including the rising tide of anti-Semitism and the othering of every kind. Looking at the Holy Land, one of my real concerns in recent years is how the spotlight on one area, be it the horrific attacks of Hamas in Israel in October 2023, the horrific bombardment of Gaza and all that entailed, and now the spotlight on Iran and Israel. For me, my concern is that too easily eyes have been diverted from the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and holding that with Gaza, there seems to be an inability to hold that big picture of the diminishing of human dignity and the danger of thinking this all started in October 2023. It's why it's such a privilege to have this evening as our speaker, Fr David Neuhaus. He's a member of the Jesuit community in the Holy Land, and we will hear this evening that he is steeped in lived experience, not only of the Holy Land, but of South Africa. He's an eminent theologian who teaches scripture in Israel and Palestine, including Bet Jala, Bethlehem University, the Salesian Theological Institute in Jerusalem. So Father David comes to us with immense academic credentials, including a PhD in political science from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and pontifical degrees in theology and scripture from Paris and Rome. He's also Emeritus Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics, migrants and asylum seekers in Israel. Somehow in the midst of all of this, he is also a researcher at the Jesuit Institute in South Africa. What we're going to hear this evening comes from someone with that deep lived experience. Father David will tell it from his perspective, and we can be sure that here is someone who continues to reflect deeply and theologically as he lives relationship in many, many different spheres of influence. And I hope that this evening will not only leave us better informed, but will also leave us uncomfortable. I hope we will be reflecting on what part we are playing and the part we could play in this big, wide and deep narrative. Poignantly, today is the anniversary of the proclamation of Israel's Declaration of Independence, read by David Ben-Gurion in the Tel Aviv Museum Hall on May the 14th, 1948. The British mandate ended. And whilst Israel celebrates Independence Day each year, for Palestinians, these days mark the start of the Nakba, catastrophe, with traumatic loss of lands and homes. It will not also have escaped your notice that today is also Ascension Day, when those first followers of Jesus in Jerusalem were living amid a sense of so many unanswered questions, uncertainty, and yet rooted in the truth of Christ's resurrection and a sense of expectancy. Nonetheless, that lament was coupled with hope as Jesus left them, as they waited for the Holy Spirit to come upon them in power. And so it seems to me this is a very poignant day for us to be meeting for this lecture. So I hope that gives you a sense of the shape of the evening. 45 minutes with David and then 20 minutes for questions. And then we will close with a prayer and Peter will just give us a few practical summings up at the end about what happens next. So without more ado, I warmly welcome Father David to give us this year's lecture.
Thank you very, very much, Bishop Rachel. Thank you very, very much, Father Peter. And thank you to all of you for coming in this evening and listening to this presentation. I am going to be doing something a little autobiographical. And of course, the attempt will be to shed light on the issues that trouble the Holy Land, Palestine and Israel, by talking a little bit about my own journey in Palestine-Israel and before I arrived in Palestine-Israel. I'm going to do that by sharing a PowerPoint and will comment on the images that we will see in the PowerPoint. And I'm going to start that right now. Okay, so the chosen title for this lecture, as you can see, is Palestine/Israel, a Catholic perspective. Once again, when I say a Catholic perspective, I'm talking not about the Catholic perspective, assuming that there was such a thing, but rather one Catholic's perspective. And I was even tempted a little to put Catholic with a small c, meaning that I would like this to be Catholic, to be universal, to be really grasping the entirety of this bleeding, torn reality that is Palestine-Israel. As Bishop Rachel pointed out, yes, today is the day the British mandate ended, the day that the State of Israel was proclaimed, the day of the beginning, the intense beginning of the Palestinian Nakba, which is an ongoing hemorrhaging of the Palestinian people. And in addition to all this, today on the Hebrew calendar, the Jewish people are marking the day of the occupation of East Jerusalem. We have seen a very, very violent day in Jerusalem itself, with tens of thousands of mostly young Jewish men and women pouring into the old city, and quite a few of them getting involved in violence against the local residents. You will see here on this first slide that I've chosen two images, hopefully to grasp the two worlds that somehow converge and yet only too seldom meet, the two worlds that I live in. On the one side, you see a beautiful street in Tel Aviv, coffee houses, the quiet of an affluent city that is really the pearl of Israeli society, the city that was created by modern Zionism. And on the other side, you see the horror of the ongoing Nakba, a picture, of course, taken very recently from the genocidal war that was waged against Gaza after the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. And so let's dive in. And I'm going to start with another important event for us as local Christians that happened on the 25th of April, when the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, an Italian Franciscan by the name of Pier Battista Pizzaballa, who has spent the last 36 years living in this land, then became our Archbishop, wrote his first pastoral letter, published it on the Feast of St. Mark, April the 25th, 2026. And I'd like to start with this citation, which I really think throws out a challenge to all of us who live here and to those who are trying to understand who are we as Christians in this society. And he writes, "It is not a matter of acting as a bridge between two conflicting parties, as if Christians were called to mediate from the outside. That is not their role. Christians in the Holy Land are not a third party, nor a neutral buffer between Israelis and Palestinians, nor a separate body from their non-Christian brethren. They are rather salt, light, and leaven within the societies to which they rightfully belong. Christians share the history, language, wounds, and aspirations of their peoples. They are not called to enclose themselves in a protected enclave, nor to flee, but to live their vocation to the full, to be part and parcel of society, sharing its fortunes and helping to ferment it from within with a vision of humanity and society rooted in the gospel." For me, these words are very challenging because, yes, I feel very strongly that I do belong, but in a certain sense, I belong to both societies, both Palestinian society and Israeli society. And it's this journey that has brought me to this place that I would like to share with you tonight, as I try again to share with you a Catholic vision of Palestine-Israel, a universal vision that attempts really to embrace all of those who live in the Holy Land today. And so I'm going to start with a part of my own identity. I am Jewish. Yes, I was introduced as a Catholic priest. I indeed am a Jesuit belonging to the Society of Jesus. I indeed am. But I began my life as a Jewish boy in a Jewish family and feel very strongly connected to those historical roots, centuries and centuries of Jewish life. You can see here photographs of me as a little boy, and then at my bar mitzvah, and then the emblem of the school I attended. I'll later talk about my life in South Africa, a Jewish day school like the Jewish day schools you have in England as well, where we received both a very Jewish education, but also in the post-Shoah period, a very Zionist education, an education that taught us that we were a people, and as a people we had a land, and that land was ours by right of history and by divine right. And the Zionist movement has played an incredibly important part in forming the minds and hearts of Jews over the last 100 years. The picture you see there at the bottom is a picture from 1978, when I was the representative of South Africa at a World Zionist quiz held in Jerusalem in order to commemorate 100 years, 1978, going back to 1878, the first modern Jewish settlement in Palestine. These are my roots. And more than that, my roots go back to Germany. My family is a family of Jews from Germany. There you see my great-grandfather, a proud soldier in the army of Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm II, we were on the other side of the war to the people I'm addressing tonight, you in England, are proud German patriots. There on the top above my great-grandfather's picture, you see an Iron Cross. We had a whole box of medals won by members of my family that devoted themselves to the defense of the German Empire. And there, the furniture store in a little town called Westerborg, in the center of Germany, not far from Cologne, with my great-grandfather, my grandfather standing outside the furniture store with our family name on the furniture store. And then, of course, yes, rooted for centuries and centuries, we have a family document that traces our family back to the 13th century in the lands of the Germanic-speaking people. And then the terrible uprooting, the coming to power of the Nazis, and the uprooting of this very, very old German Jewish community. Those that did not leave were exterminated, and there you see the passport of my great-grandmother, a passport with the swastika, a passport with the name that was imposed on Jewish women. It was not her name, Sarah. A passport that was issued for a one-way trip out of Germany as she made her way to join her daughter and son-in-law in South Africa. A few years ago, I was able to go back to my family home, a family home that I'd never seen before, that I'd only vaguely heard about. I did remember a picture of my father. There he is, a little boy, standing next to his slightly older sister in the backyard of their house in Westerborg. And a Dominican friend drove me to the town of Westerborg, and I knew the address of the family house. And arriving there on 15 Bahnhofstrasse in Westerborg, I found that the municipality had put up signs to commemorate the Jews of the town. And there you see the names of my great-grandparents, Siegfried and Sita, the names of my aunt and father, Helga and Rolf, good German Jews, observant Jews and patriotic Germans who, in 1936, fled for their lives. It was a very poignant moment to visit that house, and taking a photo around the back of the house, where in fact is the front door, I took the photo and then looked to my side and saw the names of the people who live in the house now. And I laughed. I said, this indeed is in some sense divine justice, as I noticed that the people who live where my great-grandparents and my grandparents and father once lived, their names are Arab names, Maysoon Shakra, Shahid Arafat, Omar Arafat and Muhammad Arafat, living in that house. I said, I'm glad. I'm glad that that house is a house in which people who are once again are trying to be German are living, and I hope they have better success than the Jews did. My family found refuge in South Africa. Of course, a refuge that was a little bit of an enigma. We came in as almost white people into a racist society where, of course, many of you will remember, a regime of apartheid made blacks live as second-class, third-class, in fact, citizens in a country where all rights were reserved for white people. There you see a bench in a park where it says Europeans only, a little white girl sitting on a bench, and behind her, her black maid. And another sign, caution, beware of natives. How strange to call black people natives, recognizing that we white people had come as colonial settlers into a land not ours and imposed our rule, a small percentage of the population ruling by cruelty and massive power over a vast majority of black people in South Africa. And there I am, probably completely oblivious still at a young age of what was going on in South Africa. That oblivion would be shattered as I grew into a more mature age and began to understand, informed also by my wonderful parents, about the real state of affairs in South Africa. 1976 was a very dramatic year. The central image there, 1976, the shooting of hundreds and hundreds of school children, and among them this iconic image of Hector Peterson, shot dead by the police. And on the other side of him, Nelson Mandela, a man who was languishing in prison, whose writings were banned, whose name could only be mentioned in whispers. Desmond Tutu, the Anglican Archbishop, and I had the great privilege at a very young age of being able to volunteer as a volunteer teacher in one of the programs to educate the many, many black kids who did not have schools after the 1976 uprising. The schools had been burnt. This uprising began because the government tried to impose Afrikaans education on black people who wanted to be educated, if not in their own language, then at least in English. And another seminal moment in my life, just a few days before I left South Africa for the first long period, going over to Jerusalem, my parents eager to get me out of the country. I now had a very, very conscious awareness of what was going on around me and was beginning to take positions that made my parents nervous, not because they didn't agree with the positions, but because they feared that taking such public positions would bring retribution. And so I was sent off to Jerusalem on the 15th of September 1977. Just 2 weeks before that, Stephen Biko, one of the leaders of Black consciousness, a student leader, was murdered by the police. And there is his image. I was able, on reaching Jerusalem, to finally read his whole life story, for he too was one of those people who had been banned. Alongside this, I want to mention the pride of the Jewish community. Those Jews, not all Jews, but certain very courageous Jews who took a stand for equality, for justice in the struggle against apartheid. And we see their wonderful names that have since been memorialized by the new South African government: Joe Slovo, Helen Suzman, and Dennis Goldberg, all of them dissidents, some of them spending long years in prison. Helen Suzman being a valiant voice for human rights in an apartheid-dominated parliament. And so this was the South Africa that I left behind, my parents sending me off to Israel. Israel, somehow, through my Jewish education, was supposed to be the realization of a dream. We had been taught that we were a people and that somewhere out there was a land that was actually our land. And arriving there at the age of 15 in 1977, I more or less believed the myths that we had been taught at school. There I am at the age of 15, working on a kibbutz, picking carrots. Yes, I was in a high school, and we were sent off for periods to experience the country that we were being taught was our country. But it didn't take me very long to realize that this dream had very little to do with the reality that I started to explore. Being, of course, well acquainted with an apartheid regime in Africa, South Africa, the segregation, the police presence, the military occupation of certain areas, it didn't take me long to realize that there was a lot more lying over that thin veneer of Zionist ideology. And I had the wonderful good fortune of, still very young, being swallowed up into a welcoming Muslim family. There I am with the daughter of my best friend who stands next to me on my shoulder, Usama, a religious Muslim Palestinian from Jerusalem, was the one who started to introduce me into the many, many worlds that were completely unfamiliar to me. First of all, the world of Palestinians and their experience within the state of Israel and under Israeli occupation. The world of the Arab people, the richness of this civilization, and a language that I grew to love and began to speak because in his family, his mother and father spoke only Arabic. And if I was to take seriously this opportunity that was being offered to me, it meant learning the language so that I could chat with my new mother, my new father, with my brothers and sisters, move around in their environment and understand what was going on around me. And then, of course, the world of Islam, which for me was really a long journey of discovery and an appreciation of the riches of a spiritual tradition that were manifest in the radiant faith of my adopted brother, Usama. These were the years that I also met another Jewish guy from the Holy Land, and his name is Jesus of Nazareth. I think most of you are well acquainted with him. Again, I was only 15 when I had my first encounter. Through an interest in Russian history, I began to frequent a Russian monastery, and in that Russian monastery came into contact with two women who really transformed my life. One of them was a woman who died during the Russian Revolution. Her name was Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fedorovna, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She had married a Russian archduke and then had become a nun after her husband was assassinated. I was very, very fascinated after having read her story. And then going to look for the place where she is buried in Jerusalem, a long story that I won't go into, how she was assassinated during the Russian Revolution and her body was brought to Jerusalem. I met the Mother Superior of that convent, Mother Barbara, a radiant, luminous person who spoke. Every word was impregnated with her faith in God and her love of humanity. A woman who really introduced me to belief in God and to her great faith in Jesus Christ. She was at that time 89 years old, crippled from the waist down, and yet impressed me with her incredible joy. Of course, this was not the vector my family had expected me to take. When I shared with them this strange going off the path, they were a little shocked, and it took quite some time for them to get used to it. But I remember the question my mother asked me, and it's haunted me ever since, and that is, David, how can you join them after what they did to us? The us, of course, is we Jews. The them is them Christians. And it became a very important question for me that led me beyond the Russian Orthodox Church, where really, with all of the beauty of the Orthodox tradition, the deep, deep spirituality, I was not able to find an answer. And that answer was provided for me when I started frequenting the Catholic Church and got to know the heritage of the Second Vatican Council. When I was finally baptized at the age of 26, a long time after I had encountered Christ, waiting many years until my family would accept this new reality. And when they did, they embraced me fully. I was baptized at the age of 26, and I sit there with my godmother on the day of my baptism. So, moving to Israel began an encounter with Israeli society, and my many years in the university in Jerusalem brought me into contact with a vibrant, Hebrew-speaking, predominantly secular Israeli society that was bubbling with life and creativity. But at the same time, I realized that there was a lot more going on as I experienced this bubbling society next to Usama, my brother, who began university with me. Indeed, when the time came, as it inevitably did, that I, as an Israeli citizen, having received Israeli citizenship almost upon arrival, as do all Jews who move to Israel, I was called up to serve in the army and realized that I could not be part of an army that patrolled, policed the people that I had come to love, to know, and to recognize as the indigenous people of the land. So refusing to serve in the army, I had a very particular experience of what the Israeli army is when I was slapped into an Israeli military prison, spent 2 months in a prison, a time of prayer and meditation, a time to really orient myself towards trying to love everybody I encountered. Not easy in a military prison, but certainly there I felt accompanied by God. And 6 months after coming out of prison, I was finally baptized. And so began also an engagement with the political reality. I now spoke fluent Hebrew that I had always known growing up. I had studied Arabic, and I now felt it was my time to engage. My first big demonstration was in 1982, when Israel covered a massacre of Palestinians during the Israeli occupation of Beirut. Some of you might remember the names of the camps which were running in blood as Christian Maronite forces overran the camps in the wake of the assassination of the Lebanese president Bashir Gemayel, Sabra and Shatila. That was my first demonstration in September 1982, and so began long years of activism trying to stop the occupation. There I am with the women in black. Stop the occupation, but not only stop the occupation, stop all forms of discrimination. Let us work for a society in which there is equality and justice so that there can be peace. An important discovery during these years were the Jews who were not like me, the Jews who had not come from foreign European lands, coming as settler colonials into the land of Palestine, but Jews who were Arabs, had been Arabs for centuries and centuries, part and parcel of the Arab world. Jews in Palestine and Jews in the surrounding Arab countries who had played an important role in their homelands. Here is an image of one of the great writers who moved to Israel from Iraq, Shimon Balas, who died a few years ago and who proved to be a wonderful partner in dialogue when I read his novels, incredible novels describing the world of Jewish Arabs. And again, that opened a horizon of what the land could look like if we spoke Arabic, if we sought to integrate into the world into which we had come as settler colonials with a foreign culture, a foreign language, and a politics of conquest rather than adaptation. The Intifada broke out in 1987, the great movement of rebellion of Palestinians against Israeli occupation. Many were gunned down, including people that I knew. And so a group of us decided that we would go out and speak to Palestinians and Israelis and publish a book that would try to uncover what was going on. Of course, alongside getting to know Israeli society, I became more and more familiar with Palestinian society. Usama and I began university together, and there we formed a group of friends and wandered around the country together, a group of Muslims, Druze, and Christians, and me, a Jew who believed in Jesus, going from place to place and experiencing the Palestine that was everywhere under the surface of Israel, whether it was in the Galilee or in the great towns that had once been Palestinian towns like Jaffa and Bir Saba that became Beersheba. I also began a long dialogue with institutions in the Palestinian territories. I would later come to work at Bethlehem University, which I started frequenting during the days of the First Intifada. And coming out of prison, I went to work in a Catholic hospital where many of my colleagues were Palestinians. One of them was a man by the name of Awad, and this encounter marked me deeply. That's Awad there in the center. Awad was a Palestinian nurse who spent his time taking care of patients who were predominantly Jewish patients. He was from Gaza and had studied to be a nurse on the West Bank. He had a permit that permitted him to move from Gaza to the West Bank and come to work in Jerusalem. But at a certain point, his permit was withdrawn. And so I said to Awad, who then had to pass through very difficult checkpoints, being humiliated and abused, that he should come to live with me in West Jerusalem and therefore would not have to pass through checkpoints, which he did. He came to live with me until one day my landlord came to see me, just 2 or 3 weeks after Awad had come to live with us. And the landlord said to me, "David, look, that man that is living with you, he gives me nightmares. I'm worried about my daughters." And I said to him, of course, a Jewish middle-class Israeli landlord, "Rami, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" And he said, "I have nightmares that my daughters will be raped." And I thought, this man is speaking about Awad, a nurse who spends days and nights looking after Jewish patients. I knew that it could become a very difficult situation if Rami called the police. So I very sadly informed Awad that his days of living with me had to come to an end. Awad went back to Gaza, gave up his job. And a few months later, we received the terrible, terrible news that there had been shooting outside the United Nations clinic where he worked. Looking on from the roof, he had seen that a young man had been shot. So he went down to the entrance of the clinic and tried to pull the young man in. Awad was shot dead by an Israeli sniper. Again, another victim of this endless bloodshed. In the year 2000, I was ordained to the priesthood, a very joyful occasion, just a few weeks before the second Intifada began. You see there my father doing the first reading in Hebrew. That was a great joy to have my Jewish parents now fully on board with my journey. Indeed, it was my journey that they, in their loving care of me, took on as part of their journey. And there I am, being ordained by a spiritual father, a man who has taught me almost everything I know and how to live as a Christian in Palestine-Israel today. The patriarch at that time, whose name is Michel Sabah, still going strong at 93 years old, still a leading voice in the struggle for equality, justice, and peace. I was sent off during my studies with the Jesuits to specialize in the Bible. That was what the Church of Jerusalem asked of a Jesuit who would be missioned to come and work in the Holy Land. And I've been teaching the Bible over the last 26 years in the institutions of the Catholic Church in both Palestine and Israel, and in a number of Jewish and non-Christian Palestinian institutions. The Bible is at the heart of the struggle, and how to read it might one day liberate us from the bloodshed. But of course, there's a lot of learning involved in how we should not read the Bible, a book that is so abused, misused, misquoted, and tortured into supporting the conquest that is going on all the time. Teaching the Bible is the love of my life. But just 1 year into my teaching, I was asked also to take on the role of teaching Jewish studies in Arabic. Knowing Arabic and being a Jew who could move in the Palestinian territories, even though since the year 2000 I've been doing that against Israeli law. As an Israeli citizen, I'm not supposed to go into the Palestinian territories, but insist on it as part of my vocation. Dressed as a priest, I get through the roadblocks, and teaching Judaism so that Palestinians and in the broader Arab world where I can reach, to try to get people to understand that Israel, the modern state of Israel, does not sum up what Jews have been in history, what Jews are right now, and what Jews can be in the future. Jews cannot be reduced to being soldiers, policemen, and colonial settlers. And a few years ago, I published an introduction to Judaism in the Arabic language that was printed in Beirut, and that I hope helps in some small way to make people realize that Jews were once an integral part of Arab Muslim civilization, and hopefully one day Jews can once again serve as a creative and helpful presence in the Middle East. But I soon realized that in teaching empathetically about Judaism, there was also a role to be played in teaching empathetically about Islam. And of course, being part of a Muslim family over the many, many years of frequenting the home of Usama, his parents' home when he was young, and now his home with his children, 5 children, a number of grandchildren, and studying the Quran with him and Muslim tradition, there was something also that could be added to the teaching of Islam in Christian contexts that could bring in empathy and understanding for a world that we are called to live in. Of course, a turning point came with the destruction of Gaza, the genocidal war that began after the 7th of October 2023. Israel in the beginning horrifically shocked by the violence that surged out of the Gaza Strip, instead of recognizing that that violence had been built up over decades of colonial conquest, starting all the way back in 1917, reaching a peak in 1948, continuing in 1967, and through this violent repression of the Palestinian uprisings against Israeli occupation, beginning in 1987 and again in the year 2000, Israel instead sought revenge. And the revenge had a terrible, terrible face as we engaged in a genocide that went on for 2 years. 2 years of catastrophic destruction. Tens of thousands of Gazans killed. And what does that mean now for us in this land? Does this put any hope of reconciliation under the very ruins that we have created? Searching deep within myself, within my community, the Christian community, we are challenged to find that message of resurrection, that faith that can bring us upright, heads held high, as witnesses to what can be rather than what is, looking beyond at a horizon that refuses to be shut off by war and walls and destruction and devastation. Again, finding inspiration among also Jewish people waking up. And for those of you who have not read Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning by Peter Beinart, I strongly recommend it if you're looking for hope coming out of a Jewish community that is waking up to the very dark side of Jewish nationalism and the need to reconstruct a Judaism that is free of the chains of Zionism. Over the last many years, I've been part of a reflection group, and it is here that I find not only a language to speak about this land that opens up the horizon, but also little tiny flickers of hope that if we can impregnate the society around us with a way of thinking and a way of speaking that is of respect for all who live here, and a love for the land that embraces all the inhabitants of the land, we are indeed serving a purpose. The man you see there is the same man who ordained me, a spiritual father, a great Palestinian leader, a wonderful, luminous Christian, Michel Sabah, who was our Archbishop the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem from 1987 to 2008. At the age of 93, he continues to lead us as we seek ways to live the Christian message and speak of equality, justice, and peace. Notice I put equality in big letters because I often notice that we tend to speak about justice and peace without realizing that before there will ever be justice or peace, we need to really think of humanity in all of its diversity as created in the image and likeness of God, that we all are equal in rights and in duties. And this is what is so sadly lacking. Again, the struggle for equality has marked my own personal history through Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, and now the present situation in Israel. Systems must be dismantled that cannot guarantee that every human being is treated as created in the image and likeness of God, equal in dignity and rights to all other human beings. Systems that refuse to accept that need to be dismantled. And in this wonderful group of Christian thinkers, led by Michel Sabah, we are trying to bring this to language, put words on it. And so we meet together regularly and speak about the situation. We lament and then search within our tradition, within our humanity, within this land for a discourse that can say the land differently, and through our words perhaps create a world. Just as the world was created by words that God said, so might we be able to contribute to creating a world in which people can live in equality, justice, and peace. I end my reflections tonight with two recommendations. Perhaps this is a commercial break. One of them is to read the pastoral letter that our patriarch published. They returned to Jerusalem with great joy, a proposal for living the vocation of the Church in the Holy Land, as we try to seek out a language that can say in different expression, this land, expressions of equality, justice, and peace. And this summer, in Orbis Press, that has published many, many books on Palestine-Israel, a press that has devoted a lot of energy to bringing out books of liberation theology. I have completed the publication of a book called Conquest or Leaven, which is my reflections on being a Catholic priest in Palestine-Israel. My spiritual father graciously agreed to write the foreword of that book, and I'd like to end my part in this evening with a short quotation from this book called Conquest or Leaven. Conquest is the conventional way of the world to build empires. External force is applied to resistant elements in order to force them to give way. Victory is gained by domination and the elimination of opposition. Holding on to power and constantly making use of it is the guarantee to bring about victory. The system that is put into place distinguishes clearly between victor and vanquished. This model has dominated the history of the world. It has often been the way of Christendom too. However, Jesus of Nazareth suggests a different model, the one evoked by leaven. This model points to transformation through integration. The leaven, barely visible, becomes one with the elements into which it is mixed. The change produced is gradual and organic, brought about through the symbiotic relationship between the leaven and the other elements in the mix. The distinction between the leaven and the rest dissolves as transformation spreads. Needless to say, I believe that a Catholic vision of Palestine-Israel is a vision that embraces the vocation to be leaven. Thank you very much.
Father David, thank you so much. That's such a rich sharing of yourself and your experiences and actually your reflections on this situation at the moment and from the past. And just watching all those different slides and all the rich experience you've lived throughout your life. We really are sitting at the feet of holiness and wisdom here. So thank you. We've got some questions coming in, and please do be typing your questions in. I can now see them. So please do be just typing those in, and I shall pick some out. The first question, Father David here, I think is a very pertinent one. You've talked about the identity of the Jewish people. And the question is that someone's asked here is the identity of the Jewish people dependent on the possession of the land? If not, what is the alternative? And just as you think about that, I'm just very aware that you have said so much about your own identity through all that you've shared. I'd love to talk more about that. But this is the question here about the identity of the Jewish people dependent on the possession of the land, and if not, what is the alternative?
So again, I think that this question should ideally be posed to a variety of Jewish people who do not identify as Christians, because I think that Christians would have a very specific take on the question of land and borders that derives from the gospel. But I will say something that is at least historically true, and that is that the Jewish people for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years existed, sometimes thriving, sometimes suffering, without a close identification with the land. There was always perhaps a dream of this land, but in actual fact, the vast majority of Jews only knew its name. It was never a reality. This changed in an era of nationalism, when Jewish identity was fundamentally reworked. And again, from my own family history, that should be evident. The first choice of many, many Jews was to become part of the nations in which they lived. My own family to be part of the German nation. That's what my uncles died for during the First World War, fighting for the German Empire. But the incredible tragedy of the Jewish people, particularly in Europe, was the advent of a genocidal hatred of Jews that led to the extermination of a very big part of the Jewish people during the Second World War, and convinced them that they now needed, it was absolutely essential to their well-being to have a land. Of course, this led to a situation of incredible dissonance between this need for a land and that land being inhabited by an indigenous people that was ultimately displaced from their land, turned into exiles when they were not themselves massacred. And here I drew attention, again, because time is short, that an Israeli academic who works in the United States, a professor of genocide studies by the name of Omer Bar-Tov, has just published a very, very important book called Israel, What Went Wrong. And in this book, he exactly documents how Zionism was a kind of dream for Jews of security, but how it led into this practice of conquest that ultimately becomes genocidal and therefore delegitimates itself. Again, Omer Bar-Tov is a Jewish Israeli secular expert in genocidal studies. I think his reflections are going to be very, very important to reflect on when we ask the type of question that has just been asked.
Thank you again. Thank you for that rich answer. So much to reflect on, and I hope that's what we will do this evening. You've commented there. You've used the word Zionism, and there's a question here about how you feel about the frequent conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and the question is, how do you suggest that we as Christians challenge it? Now, probably there are some Christians watching who don't want to challenge that. So how would you suggest that we approach that idea of the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism?
So first of all, let's be clear that this conflation is a political manipulation, because anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews, and any kind of hatred is racist and needs to be uprooted and fought against. And the hatred of Jews is very unfortunately a strand in the development of our own Christian tradition, as from a very early time, going back to the early church, Jews were seen as responsible for killing God, for not submitting to God's will, a rejected people, a people who were marginalized, discriminated against, and finally, it reached genocidal proportions. So anti-Semitism is something that needs to be reflected on very, very clearly. Anti-Zionism is, of course, the opposition to an ideology that many today, and I would put myself in this group as well, are defining as a settler colonial ideology, an ideology that is trying to substitute a settler population coming from somewhere else with an indigenous population, taking their land, driving them off their land, subjugating them, killing them, exiling them. A lot of what we've seen in what you referred to as the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, because you did say the Nakba took place in 1948. What we need to say is that the Nakba began in the 1940s and is continuing. So opposition to Zionism, I think, is not only legitimate, but I think that Christians are really called upon to take up a type of critique of nationalism that is violent in its expression and uses the methodology of conquest to impose its will on another people. We need to be very, very careful that we get the vocabulary correct and the concepts correct, because, yes, there are those that can slide all too easily from an anti-Zionism into an anti-Semitism, and that needs to be called out. But nonetheless, I think that the clarity needs to be underlined over and over again so that we are not bullied into affirming positions that we cannot affirm because they are immoral.
Mm. And thank you for reminding us that theme of Nakba continues. I'm very glad that you have just touched there on the settler activity. It's certainly something that I have witnessed firsthand and something I will go on speaking about in Parliament. And it's not a popular thing, but we are very clear. We've been very clear in this country politically that that is wrong, that legally it is wrong, that we have said that settler activity is wrong, that settlements are illegal, and yet we watch that constant violent taking of land, people who cannot defend themselves and are not defended. And
Rachel, I
in
do want to point out just one thing, okay?
do,
And that is that you are referring to something that is absolutely brutal and in our
yeah,
face, and that is bans of violent armed settlers going around Palestinian villages and sometimes even towns and
yeah.
cities, are terrorizing the Palestinian population and forcing them to leave their lands, their homes, their belongings. This is absolutely shocking. But
Mm,
I think that we need to be aware that as long as there is an ideology in Palestine-Israel that does not recognize the equal rights of all people, we are dealing with the dispossession of those that do not
mm,
have equality. And so this is a real issue, not only with the most radical settler
yeah.
elements, but an entire state apparatus that legitimates inequality. And as you well
Yeah.
know, the state itself defines itself as Jewish, meaning if you're not Jewish, you do not have equal rights. And so the
Yeah.
claim that Israel is a democracy is actually a parody, because you cannot be a democracy if there isn't fundamental equality among all citizens who are recognized as having a civic identity in which, for the purposes of the state, there is no distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've reminded us so strongly, and something I try and say endlessly, this is about equal human dignity, human equality for all people, which is why when we get into the language of pro and anti, it's really unhelpful, because I always say I'm pro human dignity and pro human equality, and we have to make that our starting place. And when you were talking then, one of the things I'm acutely aware of is language and vocabulary. You know, you have used different words very carefully. And for me, I wonder, a question here is about what language is it helpful for us to use? Again, we'll have people with different views on that, but what vocabulary would you hope that we here in the UK would be using wisely? And what vocabulary is unhelpful as we try and present the situation as it is with integrity, because language conveys so much of the narrative. That would take probably another lecture in itself, but perhaps one or two things which we could reflect on and pay attention to.
So I think that there are words that we need to recognize as trigger words, which does not mean that we don't need to say them. But when we do say them, we need to be aware that these can be swords into the people that we are speaking to. And so tonality is very, very important, almost as important as the words that we use. Again, a word that I could be accused of banding around as a kind of weapon word is the word genocide. And we know how many, many Jewish people feel offended by the use of that word. Again, I think that we need to stay firmly within the description of a reality that is recognized today as genocide. Another word is applying the term apartheid to South Africa. And so I think it's very helpful to be in touch with elements in Jewish society that are calling out Israeli practices by using the language. And so for me, I was for a number of years on the board of a human rights organization called B'Tselem, when B'Tselem finally came out with its document saying, this is apartheid, not only in the occupied territories, not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but inside Israel itself. I said, this is very helpful because it's introducing into the heart of the Jewish world a vocabulary that I think we do need to use, again, with the tonality, not of an attack, but of a very painful sharing of a reality that is being lived out in Israel-Palestine that we want to end for the benefit of all. And here I go back to the anti-Semitism question. I think that those struggling for the rights of Palestinians so that Palestinians can live in dignity and equality are on exactly the same side, ultimately, as those who are struggling against anti-Semitism. Let us not forget that Jews didn't go over to Palestine because they're horrible people and wanted to take Palestinian land. Again, I made that quite clear when I said Jews were pushed out of the countries where they lived, okay, by anti-Semites. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism and Zionism have been too often allies in the dispossession of the Palestinian people. So fighting anti-Semitism and fighting for Palestinian rights is ultimately fighting on the same side of the barricade.
Thank you. And we do have to be very careful about the words, but I love your emphasis there on the tonality in which we use those words is really important, holding together that equality of human dignity. Thank you. Interestingly, talking about language, someone here has said that you seem reluctant to use the term Holy Land, preferring Palestine-Israel, Israel-Palestine. Is that because you think it's unhelpful when talking about equality?
I deliberately use the word Palestine and deliberately use the word Israel because Holy Land makes it sound like Disneyland, something that floats above reality. The Holy Land is often reduced to holy places frequented by pilgrims coming from overseas. And what I want to really give a sense of is the human beings that live in this land, the human beings that are suffering. And of course, the Holy Land makes it a central attraction, but it also means that very often we kind of gloss over the fact that there are populations struggling to survive here for whom it is their homeland, not a holy land, but the land in which they have their homes, their businesses, their lives, their schools, their children are raised here. So I often tend not to use the word Holy Land because it seems to be so disincarnate. And Palestine-Israel is really where life is, where the people are.
Thank you. I've certainly shifted a lot myself in that and sometimes saying Israel, Palestine, and sometimes Palestine, Israel. So again, just to try and use that equality, whilst also remembering that Palestine is occupied Palestine. So yes, thank you. There's a question here, which I think comes back to that sort of theme of identity, which someone's talked about your own biography, your own story, and says, is multiple religious belonging liberative in the context of religious extremism in the world and also in Palestine, Israel?
So I hesitate to say that I have a multiple religious belonging. I'm profoundly Christian and own that. I am Jewish in the sense that I belong to a Jewish family. I belong to the history of the Jewish people. I identify very strongly with that. But my experience of God is not foundationally Jewish. It's foundationally Christian. As a 15-year-old boy, I didn't believe in anything when I encountered Mother Barbara and she introduced Jesus to me. I must say, though, I didn't add this, that when my parents expressed resistance, which was not religious resistance, it was historical, sociological resistance to me becoming a Christian, I was, for a period, tempted into thinking that maybe I can just stay with God and kick Jesus out of the story. And I went to study in an Orthodox yeshiva, an Orthodox school of learning in a religious quarter in Jerusalem. I just went to the classes and, said I'm a secular Jew interested in learning and loved every minute of the learning. But the problem was Jesus didn't go away. So I own that. My religious identity is definitely a Christian. But where I feel it very, very helpful is to be profoundly in loving relationship with Jews and with Muslims, and of course with other kinds of Christian, so that I can never generalize in a negative way about them, and where I find that I am all the time learning from them. I mean, when I go around and I've attended mosque with Usama many times, sitting next to him as he goes through the prayers, or sitting with him to study Quran, I find that my own religious life is incredibly enriched. I continue to frequent the synagogue. I know I'm going there as a Christian, but the liturgy of the synagogue is in my guts. It comes out very naturally. That's what I grew up with. That's what we had at school. And I rejoice celebrating with Jews. And I think that this kind of it's more than empathy, it's an intimate love for other traditions. The awareness that they have much to teach me means that I hope that I won't fall into the patterns of stereotyping that go with communities that are on the defensive and engaged in ideological battles with other communities.
Thank you. And what comes through to me as you talk in that, two really big words come to mind is that of relationship and community. And in all that we've been talking about, we understand at the heart of who God is relationship, with God, with one another, with all of creation, and that we're created to live in community. And you just spoke then and in your presentation very strongly of not othering people and learning from people, and yet being really key about your rootedness in Jesus Christ. And I found that really inspiring and encouraging, and something that I think we believe we all need to go on working at, how we go towards one another and yet stay rooted strongly in our Christian identity, but learning from people and going towards one another, and really standing against any sort of othering,
Just a
which
word
is
about one of my favorite images of Jesus is after that incredibly powerful day in Capernaum, right at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. He's done all of these incredible things, and people are in absolute awe. And then the next day comes, and he goes out early in the morning to pray in a deserted place. And the disciples come and hunt him down. Usually it just says they went out to look for him. No, they didn't go out to look for him. They came to hunt him down and to take him back into the ghetto, saying, "You're ours, you stay here." And what Jesus answers is, "I have come to go out." And that sense of Jesus going out in broader and broader circles to encompass more and more in his embrace has been a real inspiring icon for me of who Jesus is and the Jesus that I'm called to follow.
beautiful. And I think that theme of going out, that theme of relationship, in a way leads into this next question, which is about young Israelis conscripted into the army. Certainly something that I've been perturbed about in conversations, and I've spent time with the organisation Breaking the Silence, who are those who've been soldiers in the IDF and are now speaking out at great cost. But this question really says, would you like to reflect, well, I'm going to ask you if you will reflect on the moral harm done to young Israelis conscripted into the army and expected to be brutal?
Absolutely. I mean, I faced this challenge when I was conscripted and was told by the army authorities. I expressed my beliefs to them that I could not engage in violence, that I would not become a part of a policing force over a people with whom I was intimately connected. And what they said to me was, no, you don't need to worry. You'll be able to be exactly that person wearing a uniform and carrying arms. And I said, I won't be able to be that person because there is a group dynamic involved that will take me over, that will make me as animalistic as our soldiers are known to be when they're in that role. So let us remember that this does not only begin with conscription into the army. This begins with the baby coming into the world and drinking with the mother's milk a way of thinking about us and them that is then incredibly reinforced in a system of education that is nationalistic, a system of education where there is no doubt who we are and who they are. When I was a 15-year-old kid, I walked through an Arab village. It was the first time I walked through an Arab village. I had to go from one place to another, and the quickest way to go was through the Arab village, and I didn't think twice. I walked through. That night I came home and I wrote a poem about the experience of walking through the village. And I keep that poem with me because the poem is chock-a-block with absolute stereotypes about how every stinking, ugly, hateful Arab was coming towards me with a knife under their cloak to stab me. And for years afterwards, when I'm now part of a Muslim family, by the way, from a village right next door from the one that I walked through, I'm saying, where did I get that from? I had never had any experience of any Arabs. Where did I get that language from? And recognized, of course, the incredible role of education in forming us as hate-filled human beings. These hateful human beings go into paramilitary training already at the end of high school. They are then taken on trips to Auschwitz to put them at the very edge of Jewish history so that they can stare into the hatred of others for Jews. They are then incorporating that into their lives as they come back to go and fight against the Palestinians, against the rest of the Arab world. It's horrendous. Okay, absolutely horrendous. And, when I was in the prison and was imprisoned with soldiers who had done absolutely horrific things to Palestinians, things that had not been ordered, things that were regarded as going beyond the call of duty, I felt incredible compassion for them because I realized they're the product of a system that has produced killing machines. Okay, we have a talented modern Israeli author by the name of Yishai Sarid, who wrote an absolutely nightmarish novel called The Victorious One. And it's about a psychologist, a woman psychologist, who works in the army. And her role in the army is to train people not to have any sense of trauma killing other people. I mean, and again, this is not specific to Israel. This is specific to countries that are founded on very strong ideologies that engage in politics of conquest against other populations. It was true in South Africa. Oh my God, was it not true in Nazi Germany? You have to dehumanize the other person. And that's not just during your military service. That's a whole life of integrating a person into a society based upon the rejection of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would really encourage, if people want to see some of these stories, do Google Breaking the Silence, because there are so many powerful stories. And in January, when I and two other bishops, we were taken to Hebron and all the horror in Hebron, we went with one of the ex-IDF soldiers, and he talked about wherever he goes, there is a bubble of sovereignty around him that he will never be able to get rid of. And that's really reflecting what's in that bubble of sovereignty, however much he wants to be equal and stand out and stand up for the Palestinians, he will
Bishop
always
Rachel,
be the
there's
one.
something in your words that I just want to point out.
Mm.
I'm sure that it's not conscious, but for me it's so glaring. When you insist on referring to that army as the IDF, that's part of the whole mythic
Yeah,
bubble that is
yeah,
built around the army. It's
yeah,
all defense,
yeah. And
when
it's not.
actually it's,
Yeah,
it's the ICF,
yeah,
the
yeah,
Israeli Conquest
yeah,
Force. So
yeah.
I never call it the IDF. In
Mm.
anything I write, I say the Israeli Army, because
That's
there's
really helpful,
very
really
little
helpful.
to do with
Um,
defense.
Yeah, because
It's a
that's
very
how it would be
aggressive.
described. But actually, again, the language we can use in the same way. I've been taught by Palestinians to say, please don't talk about the war in Gaza. There is no war because there are not two
Right.
armies. And
Yes.
that's really helped me change my ways. So these sort of conversations are really helpful. There's a couple of questions I'm going to come to at the end, but here's one which I'm sure you have been very used to dialoguing with these sorts of questions. Someone here has said, in the Bible, God is very passionate about his land, and he chooses who should have sovereignty over it. The second coming is dependent on the Jews being in Jerusalem and the land, although Ezekiel says others can also live in the land under Jewish sovereignty. What God says does not seem to have been taken into account in your presentation. Now we could have a whole nother session
Mhm.
on this, but I just wondered if you could give us a few things about how you respond when you're asked those sorts of questions. And it's a fair question. Thank you.
It's certainly a fair question. And as a teacher of the Bible, something I was sent to do 3 decades ago and do with incredible passion, the Bible for me is certainly a word of God for our world. I would be very hesitant, though, to rip certain texts out of context and apply them just because of a certain similarity in names. So the word Israel, what does it mean in the Bible? What does it mean also in the Bible when you read the Bible as a Christian? Okay. And does it mean the state of Israel? Okay. The land. What is the concept of the land? Again, the Jews need to be in the land for Christ's second coming. What kind of a need is that? Okay. I think that these are all questions that need to be asked with one eye on reality and one eye on the biblical text. Sometimes I fear that when our two eyes are on the biblical text, we can squash, smash, destroy reality because it doesn't correspond to how we've understood the text. But let us remember that this is a living word of God, meaning that the living God is speaking to us through the text. And I spend a lot of my time reading the biblical texts, trying to explain the biblical texts, trying to explain how they should be, can be read, but alongside that, spending a lot of time and effort trying to dissemble, destructure the way that some people are reading the biblical text that creates so much violence. And so one of the wake-up moments was I did my novitiate as a Jesuit in Egypt. And I remember reading the Psalms in Egypt and saying, oh my God, what am I saying? And God singing, hallelujah, hallelujah, drowned all the Egyptians in the sea. What does this mean when you're in Egypt? So again, when it comes to the land, what does it mean to be so sure of what God is actually saying about our present reality based upon an idiom that was perfectly appropriate for a world 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, and not take into account the reality of today and those that are being affected by probably a not very healthy reading of the Bible. So for me, these are ethical questions that need to be asked as we really wrestle with that text in order to find what God is telling us, how we should live today. Again, I'm convinced that there is a word of God there in it, and that's why I spend my life teaching it. At the same time, it's not simple to extract that word. And I'm afraid there are many people out there that are reading, and here I'll use a kind of religious, pious language, who are reading a kind of satanic voice out of the text, which means destruction, devastation, and genocide for some. Again, we as Christians need to wake up that we've done that over centuries and centuries and centuries. We were so sure that word was telling us to treat Jews in a particular way, to treat indigenous people in a particular way. And I think we've woken up to the horrors of badly interpreted and badly read biblical texts.
Thank you. And thank you to the person who put that question there, because I think these are the real realities of things we need to grapple with and need to be honest about. So as you say, we are reading the Word of God as the Word of God, but what is God saying to us? Thank you for beginning that. And I'm sure we could spend many, many hours, and we should spend many hours talking about these things. We're coming towards a close, and there are a little cluster of questions which are really about us here in the UK. One from someone who's a British Christian with a Jewish ancestry, someone else who's asking about what we can do here for the cause of peace and justice living in the UK. And I am so grateful to you for coming from your perspective, where you are and what you have lived. And for many people on this webinar will be in the UK, sitting in this context. Hope is a word that I have been really challenged about using when I've been in Israel-Palestine. I think it's a word we band around really easily. But as we here in the UK, people on this call are obviously interested, I presume wanting to think about these things and do something. If I can use that word hope, what is it, Father David, that you would hope for from Christians in the UK? There'll be a whole plethora of things, but people who listen, what would you hope that people here on this webinar might do or say in the UK?
So before I have a kind of brief answer to that, I want to say a word about hope, because I think we need to be very careful to distinguish hope from optimism.
Absolutely.
Optimism is kind of, some kind of not very clear vision of some bright future that is not rooted in any kind of reality. hope is profoundly rooted in reality, because we know that the tomb is empty. That's the hope that we hold on to, that we have experienced that man who was dead is risen from the dead and has left behind an empty tomb. That means that for real hope, we need to go back to that primordial experience of a God who is good and wants good for the world and will ultimately be victorious. Okay, if I was God, I wouldn't give us free choice and I'd impose the good. But for reasons that I don't understand, God seems to insist on giving us the free choice to make all the mistakes we make. And within the mess that we create, hope is, I think, looking at the world and trying to find there the little lights that light up the world and make it look different. Again, part of it is trying to formulate a language that opens up to a different horizon, a horizon beyond walls and wars. So what to do? I would say first and foremost, for those that, like myself, are religious people, we need to give time to prayer, which doesn't mean we ask God to solve the problem. We can do that. That's a very welcome prayer. But that we leave times for silence so that God can propose to us where we can find ourselves in helping to create a better world. For me, prayer is an encounter with an other. And that other, God, can then bring me to understandings that I might not have at this very moment when I'm full of the emotions of the moment. So I think number one, prayer. Number two, you've mentioned it yourself, and I understand from our previous conversations how transformative it's been, is pilgrimage. Okay, so for those of you who can, to come here, and for those who can't, to try and engage with those who can. So really create some kind of living link with this land, and in a very particular way with Christian brothers and sisters who live in the land, not only, not exclusively, but in a special way with Christian brothers and sisters to find out about experience of the land at first hand. So pilgrimage meaning not only coming to see the dead stones, but creating a living link with the living stones, the Christians who are here and who are determined to remain here. And in God's providence, hopefully there will always be Christians here. So that's the second point. Third, to be informed. Okay, it connects to the second point of pilgrimage, but to be informed so that you can feed into a language about this land that opens up horizons. Again, we've stressed so much this evening, and you've been in unison with that stress, equality. Okay, to speak in a way that really promotes the type of discourse that we would like to see become reality. So yes, equality, certainly justice, certainly peace, to speak about that and to speak about it from an informed place. And then, of course, I remind always, this is the sad reality we're in, we depend on you taking responsibility, informing your political authorities, and making sure that they make decisions that are based upon upright, moral, just decision-making, rather than cowardice, caving into lobbies, being manipulated by governments that have vested interest in conquest and war. So I think these are some of the things that we all need to try and do. And of course, we can do all of them much better if we create communities in which we can meet and share our concerns.
Thank you so much, Father David. We could go on talking for a very long time, and it's been an immense privilege for me to talk to you before this webinar. And I know that you will have provoked people in their thoughts and in their hearts. There'll be things that people want to battle against, and things where people will be going away saying thank you for shining a light there. And before I pray, I just want to say thank you for focusing on the hope of the empty tomb, because for me, when I am in Palestine-Israel, there is no talk of hope in terms of optimism. And I've always ensured that on the last day before I've gone to the airport, I have gone to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And not because I want to say it's all fine, but to say the one thing we absolutely know is that the tomb is empty, and to light those little candles that you can there at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to say that the darkness will never overcome the light. And I don't mean that tritely, don't have the answers, but to be
And
in
you
a
know very
place.
well that here we don't call it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We never say the Church of the Tomb. We say
Yeah,
the Church of the Resurrection.
resurrection. Yeah.
We can
And I
introduce that
think
into
that,
language as well.
yes, absolutely. And I think for me, it is how we enter into that, how we here can enter into that with courage. Thank you for your courage, for your tenacity, for your compassion, and what shines through is your deep love for people, that sharing of the love of God with people. You're clearly passionate about that equality in each person created in the image of God. And I want to give such thanks for you, and just how God has woven together your story in your place of pain and your place of joy, and how that's woven together, and you're sharing that rich wisdom and your identity. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to say a prayer, and then I'm going to pass to Peter, who's going to just say a couple of sentences to sum up, and then we will be done. And may I just thank everyone on this call. But let's just be still for a moment. And if you're someone who prays, then this is a moment of prayer. If you're someone who simply wants to be silent, then use the silence. Gracious God, we give you such thanks for the amazing mystery that in your love we are each created in your image. And we long to join in with your kingdom work of restoration and transformation. We ask that we would learn yet more about lament as we hold fast to the hope of the empty tomb, and as we cry out and abide with your people in Israel-Palestine. Open our eyes, open our ears, open our hearts, that we might be those who are willing to use our voices, to use our hearts and minds, to enter into justice and peace and equality that comes from you. And we give you such thanks for Father David. We ask your blessing on him, on who he is, in all that he does, in his engagement with people as he lives a deep life of relationship with you and people in all of creation. We ask your blessing on him this night. And we offer you ourselves in the name of Christ. Amen. Peter, over to you for the final words.
On behalf of the my colleagues in Manchester, the Luther King Centre, and us all at Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, thank you, Father David, for an immensely rich presentation. And this lecture is always about theology and justice, and that is what we have heard. And we are immensely grateful to you. And our prayers continue to go with you and all those in Palestine and Israel. And thank you to Bishop Rachel for chairing us this evening. We're very grateful for your leadership. This this lecture will be recorded and made available via our website, where you can find previous year's lectures, are all available on a variety of different subjects. But thank you all very much for attending this evening. We've had a lot of people and a lot of questions, and it's been a very rich 90 minutes. Thank you all very much, and God bless.